So here's a question. Have you ever fallen out of love with a game? A game that you've played a bunch, that you've enjoyed, you've logged a bunch of plays, owned it in your collection, and you break it out one day to sit down and play it and go, yeah, I'm kind of done with that. Yeah, happened to me recently, big time. Okay, so Champions of Midgard is a game that a lot of people made comparisons to Lords of Waterdeep when it came out, for good reason. It's a relatively easy to understand worker placement game that has a heroic theme that would appeal to people who typically like heavily thematic American games, but this one also touts a more traditionally American style random element through dice rolls in order to combat the monsters that you're going to have to face all around the board. Now, Lords of Waterdeep has been one of my favorite worker placement games for ages, and it still feels fresh and hits the table relatively often. I just played it as my first 6-player game coming out of the pandemic quarantine with fully vaxxed friends. Yes, a plug that everyone out there should get vaccinated if you can, so that way we can do more awesome gaming together. But also, it's a game that I continue to go back to time and time again. Now, when Champions of Midgard came out, it was a game that I really enjoyed. I really liked the theme, I liked the dice element to the game, and yeah, I kind of liked the comparison to Lords of Waterdeep. Never fully replacing Waterdeep, but as a new type of worker placement that I could add to my collection, a collection of worker placement games that was continuing to grow because it was one of my favorite genres. But over time, the flaws apparent in the game have started to, I guess, eat at me a little bit. Now, this isn't to say that I hate games with luck. I still find the dice element of this game to be really novel, but there are some implementation issues with the game that I think are worth talking about to kind of revisit a game in my collection that I've sunk a lot of time in, but am ultimately going to get rid of. So first off, let's talk about risk. Let's talk about the random chance in this game, because there are a lot of fantastic Euro, American, hybrid, whatever types of games out there that have random elements, and I think we can all agree that the best of them are games where luck doesn't fully dictate your game, but you are reacting to the random elements, and that you have ways of preparing for and mitigating those chances. And in truth, Champions of Midgard has a lot of that. You have the Sage's Hut action that allows you to look at the journeys. You have reroll tokens. You know what sorts of combat stats the enemies are going to have, and you know what are the potential outcomes with your warriors that you can send into battle, so you can play the probability game. But every time you send a warrior against a monster in this game, you have 2 potential thresholds of luck that you're going to have to deal with. One is that you're going to have to deal with that journey card. The game invites you to play with a degree of risk. You can't always anticipate things with the Sage's Hut action. And so sometimes you're going to go and face a card that says, all quiet, there's no problems whatsoever. On the other hand, sometimes you're going to end up losing potentially 2 warriors or some food, which can be really costly and also make you lose 2 warriors. And then after you get done with that, you're going to fight the monster, which has its own potential outcomes. Now, this in and of itself wouldn't be that big of a deal, except for the fact that there is such a wide disparity between how great an excellent dice roll is, where your warriors survive, you kill the monster, you get all the points, you get a bonus reroll token, and how detrimental, devastating even a bad roll can be, where you accounted for everything that you could possibly account for, you lose something along the way from the card flip, you go into the battle, you roll the dice, it just does not work out, you use a reroll token, it still doesn't work out, your warriors die, you didn't get the points, and everything that you've been working towards for potentially a round or more is undermined, and then you'll have to spend at least the next round recovering from. That's part of the inherent risk of this game, but that disparity between outcomes is a huge problem in a modern game design sense. Next is a problem that I have with just overall balance in the game. And I'm not talking about the balance of the enemies or the runes or the sages' huts, which are things that people can optionally engage with, but the fundamental balance between the player powers is a rough time of it when you're playing the game, because there are some that are broadly useful. Every game you can capitalize on the ability to use the ship action for free as opposed to one costly gold, because especially at the beginning of the game, money is tight. Or maybe you beef up your swordsmen and they suddenly are much better dice. That is a broadly applicable power. On the other hand, the power where your spent reroll tokens give you 2 points, or the one where you get a point every time that you roll doubles on a dice, that is so situational. It's not something that you can always account for, and also it doesn't help you escalate throughout the game. It doesn't help you do more, do better as you play. Yeah, it's more points on the outset, but it's not going to help your chances of survival, which is really where it's going to snowball into many more points. It's also pretty discouraging for players at the table when you see someone capitalizing on their power constantly, whereas you're like, man, mine's only triggered like 3 times this game. And then the last big thing, which I think is really the nail in the coffin for this game for me, is that in spite of having these different player powers, in spite of having the different journey cards and the different monsters and all these things that flip up that require a lot of upkeep, I don't change how I play from game to game to game to game unless it's at a whim. The strategy that I play is going to fundamentally be the same strategy that anyone plays. I'm going to look at what monsters are available, what my Sage Huts have dictated that I might get some extra points for, try to collect some sets, try to get rid of some troll tokens. Nothing makes it feel like the game took on a different flavor each time that I played, that I had a limitation that kind of drove me into a particular strategy versus another. And this isn't really like a sandboxy game like Caverna or Agricola, for that matter, where I feel like I have this wide open world where I can cultivate very specific strategies. This is a game where essentially you're going to be doing the same thing, it's just at a couple different depots. You're not going to have a much different development than other players, and the player powers alone aren't going to encourage you to do something different, except for the white dice might be a little better this game. You might be able to use the ship action for free, so you don't have to hesitate to use that, but still, they don't give you a different flavor. This is where the comparison to Lords of Waterdeep really falls flat for me, because Lords of Waterdeep, even though it may be a more simplistic game in that there's less moving parts going on, the player powers that you have are going to encourage you into distinct feeling games. And on top of that, the emergence of new buildings that are owned by particular players are going to make certain resources come up more often in abundance. You're going to be able to do it at different exchanges. It just feels like a more dynamic game that has more replayability, where it takes on a different flavor from game to game to game to game. Not to mention the different quests that come up, in particular plot quests, which are going to pivot from one thing into another in distinct and interesting and thematic ways, in a way that Champions of Midgard doesn't. Ultimately, I'm not here to just say this is a terrible game that no one should play, but in a year in which I've spent a lot of time reflecting on my own collection, my collecting habits, and trying to make an effort to come out of 2021 with fewer games than I started, in spite of adding new games to my collection, in spite of reviewing tons of games, I wanted to think really critically about some of the games that I've just taken for fact as games I love. That may be a particular problem for someone who's blessed with an abundance of games to choose from, but if nothing else, I think this is a call to action that everyone should think critically about your favorites and think about why you like them, why you get them to the table, and if there are games that you play out of obligations because you have a sentimental attachment to them, you have a certain memory to them, and they're on your shelf, and if they're on your shelf, you better spend time with them in that sunken cost fallacy sort of way. Well, maybe it's time to trim some of the fat. And that is our review of Champions of Midgard, a retroactive review. As always, thank you so much for watching. I've been Jack for the Cardboard Herald.